Hey all, today I'd like to talk to you all about Swamp Thing, his pre-2011 run in particular, something that you might call classic Swamp Thing. I'll talk about modern Swamp Thing in another video, but like I mentioned in my Constantine video, these are arguably the same character now due to convergence anyway. I'm going to be trying my best to go over Alec Holland's appearances from throughout his entire run, so if some of them seem lower end at first, that's just because he grew stronger over time. I also want to try something different for this video because, well, Swamp Thing himself is a little bit different. So I'm also going to try and explain the narrative meaning behind some of his most major events. The Swamp Thing we all know today truly got going in 1984 when Alan Moore took over the ongoing and struggling Swamp Thing comic line. He turned the bland story of a swamp man into the horror-fueled otherworldly journey of the Swamp Thing. Where the character was previously written as a man turned into a plant creature, now it was the tale of a plant that thought it was a man. When Alec Holland was caught in the explosion at his lab, he didn't continue to survive on as a plant creature. He died, and the plants around him rose up, consuming his intelligence and fooling themselves into thinking they were Alec Holland. More of a monster than a man now, he was a creature of the green, a strange cosmological structure that encompasses all plant life. But this bizarre existence comes with its own advantages. Harming the Swamp Thing is incredibly difficult, as his physical body is merely an extension of his spiritual self that is rooted in the green. His body can be completely destroyed or burned, and he will simply regrow a new one from a nearby patch of greenery. He is connected to every plant on the planet, and can emerge from any of them by simply letting his current body die and regrowing a new one elsewhere, kinda like teleportation. He can even create multiple copies of himself at the same time. On one occasion, he was disconnected from the Earth involving a plot with Lex Luthor, and his body was destroyed by napalm, preventing him from reappearing there. So instead, he reached out to the stars, growing a new body on a foreign planet. Even when the Anti-Monitor destroyed most of the universe, Swamp Thing was still able to regenerate, either from the Anti-Monitor's antimatter himself, or from another universe's green entirely. On one occasion, even the direct destruction of his astral form wasn't even enough to stop Alec from regenerating. His manipulation of plants goes beyond just his own body though. He was able to turn all of Gotham City into a rainforest in only a few moments, and could remove it just as rapidly. He also turned the crater of Coast City into a forest in only a few moments. On one occasion, he was even able to completely replenish the ecosystem of the entire planet of Rann, and was able to create a plant-filled town with sculpted plant people he had created. Very early on in his run, a being with a weaker connection to the green than Swamp Thing, and kind of just hijacking of his connection to the green, called Jason Woodrue or the Floronic Man, was able to increase the oxygen production of every plant on Earth by 10 times, an event that put all life on Earth at jeopardy. The world's ecosystem would have been ruined by Jason Woodrue if Swamp Thing hadn't pointed out to him that the destruction of all life, humans and animals, would mean that the oxygen the plants were producing would never get converted into CO2, and so all of the plants on the planet would die, causing Jason to fall into despair and give up on his plan, as well as being cast out by the green for failing it. These plant-based powers can be used more directly for combat too, like when he turned somebody into a tree using the lunch they had just eaten, and can even incapacitate humans just using the flora in their gut. Swamp Thing has been able to synthesize drugs for treating poisons, and can create his own poisons in the form of poisonous plants like Nightshade, and on one occasion, he even created acid to defeat the Champion of Stones. His various avatars can be manipulated to great extents as well, growing to the size of skyscrapers or even mountains. Swamp Thing can go small too, shrinking himself down to a cellular level, and on one occasion, growing so small that it seemed like he entered the microverse. If you're curious about how the microverse works, check out my cosmology video, but I'll cut it short here and just say that it's much smaller than the subatomic. This mighty power extends out into the realm of absurdity, giving Swamp Thing some of his most powerful forms, like Chair Thing or this weird fish boat thing. Swamp Thing's mind hacks is impressive as well. He can generate hallucinogenic dust and control people on a biological level using pheromones. His power even works on insects. He has directly invaded Aquaman's mind, which is something that even Martian Manhunter has struggled with in the past, and is able to directly access the memory of other beings like he did to Constantine, and on one occasion even a dead child. His mind is so powerful that the entire Parliament of Trees, which is made up of multiple Earth elementals like himself, was only barely able to hide their deepest secrets from him, and Alec directly overpowered 4 of the Parliament's most prominent members simultaneously. He was also able to make direct contact with the Great Darkness itself, where others like Mento were completely incapacitated from merely scraping the surface of it. On a separate occasion, the Hawk people of Thanagar used a device called a Mind Eater on him as well, which he was able to recover from. Not only can Swamp Thing interact with things on some kind of sentient, intangible, mind-based level, but he can also interact with things on like a soul or astral level. He was able to free Abigail's soul from her body, and was also able to absorb a host of evil spirits, turning them into perfumes within his body. He was even capable of forcing himself into the afterlife using his astral form. Other things become possible whilst he is in an astral state, and when I say astral state, I'm talking about when he hasn't got his plant avatar, he's just flying around as a soul. Like this, he can travel between different planets, and even learn to travel through time itself. It's possible for him to bring others with him as well, like when he teleported Captain Atom and Red Tornado against their will, or when he stranded another plant elemental on Mars. Swamp Thing's intelligence can't be faulted either. He's gained the wisdom of the Parliament of Trees, whose experience goes back to the first plants, and in one aptly named comic called Swamp Think, he decided to grow his brain to comprehend more. His consciousness extended out across the entire planet, eventually reaching the gods of Skyland within the Godsphere. See my multiverse video if you want to know more about that. He continued to spread his consciousness out to such an extent that he could perceive the most fundamental mysteries of creation, like synchronicity itself, which is essentially the universal constant underlying coincidence. I went into more detail of this force in my Constantine video. Eventually, his consciousness expanded to the point where he reached a direct understanding of God. Swamp Thing has shown a great capacity for his own reasoning and wisdom as well, perhaps more so than any other comic character. When the Great Darkness appeared, many incredibly powerful entities like Etrigan, Dr. Fate, and the Spectre tried to fight it, but were ultimately sucked up by the entity instead, where it asked them what it means to be the Great Darkness. Because before the light of the Presence, there was no need for a name for the Great Darkness. It had no purpose and nothing to define itself by. But now that the light existed, it had something to compare itself to, and so it needed an identity. Etrigan's answer was that it was evil, and that the Great Darkness was destined to be locked into an endless battle with the light. However, this answer disappointed the strange being of darkness, tossing Etrigan out. Dr. Fate told the being that he was a vile and wretched existence, only to be disposed of. The darkness found this answer equally unappealing. The Spectre told it evil only existed to be made an example of, so that others would fear God's authority even more, which again was unsatisfactory to the being. It wasn't until Swamp Thing willingly walked into its massive darkness that it got the answer it was seeking. Swamp Thing proposed that evil was the degradation of good, and that it acted as the fertile soil from which good would spring, in the same way that when an animal dies, it becomes the soil from which new life can grow. After hearing this, the Great Darkness decided to rise up in unison with the light, rather than fighting it, becoming a union of yin and yang, an event that would change the nature of creation forever. Some of Swamp Thing's other assorted hacks include manipulation of technology, and the ability to see things beyond the ordinary, like when he could see what was wrong on the inside of Batman's body. He could construct working air conditioning and even create music with his plants. He put a Silver Age Superman to sleep and could create wings for himself to fly on. His raw brute strength has been enough to incapacitate Captain Atom in one shot, and he was able to trade blows with the demon Etrigan. But his better feats come from directly manipulating the power of the green itself. In one of his earliest fights, he was able to defeat Anton Arcane, a being whose power was compared to Trigon and the Spectre. Anton Arcane's arrival on the Earth in that state was so immense that everybody felt it, and even the Joker stopped laughing. Swamp Thing has travelled all the way out to the source, even going inside an Aleph with Metron, resulting in one of the best feats in all of DC Comics history when Darkseid called him an academic chicken. And on another occasion, he was able to manipulate the entire green at once, turning it into a plant-like city. This is impressive because the green has been described as existing within a trans-dimensional space, and extends out even to realms like heaven and hell. Swamp Thing's list of equipment is pretty short, with the only notable mentions being his armor made from wood that came from the Garden of Eden, which was able to repel the attacks of a fairly powerful demon, and on one occasion, he also had in his possession a mother box. There were also Swamp Things that were given the powers of Black and White Lanterns respectively, with the White Lantern Swamp Thing destroying his opposite. Using the White Lantern, he was also able to restore the environment of planet Earth, but this was something that base Swamp Thing would be capable of anyway, and other than that one feat, these two Swamp Things don't really do anything interesting with their lantern rings. Eventually, Swamp Thing was able to utilize more than just the green and the Parliament of Trees, however. He became one with the Parliament of Stones, bridging the divide between the two parliaments, and becoming an elemental of the whole Earth, rather than just an elemental of plants. This gave him the power to manipulate stone, which he used to create a stone figure. He joined with the Parliament of Waves, gaining control of water, but at this point, Swamp Thing sort of started to realise that as he gained more power, more of his humanity was starting to slip away, and even went so far as to try and reject the Parliament of Vapors, but they bestowed the power upon him anyway. In this state, he created a complete body for Anton Arcane using every element, and with these powers, he can freeze the blood in a person's veins, or suck dry their cranial fluid, burst their hearts, or even completely dehydrate them. The Phantom Stranger also said that a physical battle with him would be impossible, implying that Swamp Thing was much stronger than himself at that time. The Word even went so far as to say that this Swamp Thing's power rivaled the voice of God. Alec Holland's loss of humanity has been a theme ever since Alan Moore wrote his first few issues for Swamp Thing. But here, at the climax of the story, this is more obvious than ever. Swamp Thing now viewed himself as some kind of god, above even angels and demons. His hatred for nature's failure grew, and so he aspired to kill God, replace him, and then replace all life with some grand new world in his own ideal. Eventually, he would go on to reach the Parliament of Flames, the Parliament who predates the trees, stones, vapor, and waves. But in order to claim this power, he had to give up the last vestiges of his humanity. What was once Alec Holland was cast out, leaving only the Swamp God. After gaining control of fire, Swamp Thing finally became a member of the Parliament of Worlds. God was dead, and Swamp Thing was ready to mantle his position and replace the world with his new one. But the loss of his humanity, something that he initially rejected, something he thought was corrupting him, gave him a new perspective. The hatred he had for the failures of humans and nature in general was a byproduct of his human self to begin with. Now that he was omnipresent, one with everything, he could see from the perspectives of all. From this vantage point, it was impossible for him to hate, as he understood the perspectives of all beings. He saw that even someone as evil as Anton Arcane was capable of redemption, and so instead of replacing the world, he united it, giving all beings an understanding of all beings, the same understanding that he had, and bringing about the new life that he had wanted, not through genocide, but through a new way of thinking and enlightenment. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Look out for a Darkside video in the future, and if you like Vertigo and DC Comics, check out some of my other content. Other than that, I'll see you all next time.